Hey folks, in the last video we talked about the 5 stages of early neural development. Most of that happened prenatally before birth. In this video we're going to talk about neural development, brain development after birth or postnatal, and we're going to talk about the role of experience in shaping brain development. Brain volume increases about 4 times between birth and adulthood. We already talked about the vast proliferation of new neurons and eventual death of about half of those during early development as the brain goes from a single cell, right, to um, mostly a fully formed brain at birth. Between then, it gets about 4 times larger. So you as an adult have a bigger brain than babies. Now, why is it so much bigger? Well, most of the growth in brain size doesn't come from new neurons. In fact, we're pruning neurons, right? So we're not actually getting a lot of new neurons. What we're getting are more synapses, synaptic genesis, and dendrites branching out. So whereas we've created more neurons than we need during early development, we're going to prune some of them back. We haven't developed all of the synapses and all of the dendrites to draw connections between the neurons that we've developed. Synaptogenesis and dendritic branching peak in the visual cortex at around 4 months. Babies within the first 4 months have a lot of difficulty seeing. Their visual processing is not great. They can basically see nothing. They're just getting lights and shadows. And then as they develop their visual cortex, or basic visual processing is developing over those first 4 months. And so a lot of visual stimuli is really interesting to them as they're developing basic visual processing. The prefrontal cortex comes on a little bit later, so they're very front of our brain. Around year 2, we start to sort of peak in terms of the amount of synaptogenesis and dendritic branching that's going on. That is going to continue later in life, but you can see early on we're just trying to see the world, and then we start to process frontal lobe later. The other thing going on with the brains getting bigger, 4 times larger, is that we're myelinating the neurons that exist. So when the neurons develop early for babies, prenatally, they haven't formed myelin in most cases. And if you remember, those myelin sheaths are going to make our neurons communicate more efficiently and more quickly. So getting a visual signal quickly back to my occipital lobe, or getting a signal from my tip of my finger to my brain so that I can do fine motor movements of my fingers and deal with the world around me and, I don't know, play the clarinet, right? Those kinds of um, far-reaching signals or very fast signals are going to be difficult to do until I've myelinated those neurons. So I get faster transmission, and I'm myelinating my prefrontal cortex all through adolescence, making my prefrontal cortex not get more neurons, but become more efficient. Okay, so most of the growth in brain size is not new neurons, it's new synapses and dendrites, and new myelin. Mentioned a couple times in the last slide that the prefrontal cortex sort of comes online in terms of synaptogenesis and dendritic branching in a couple years, and then it continues to grow and build myelin all through adolescence. And you've probably heard this about people, is that our brains aren't fully developed until we're post-adolescence. Mostly what we're talking about there is this prefrontal cortex, the very front of the frontal lobe. There's other parts of the frontal lobe that do movement, that do language, that control our eyes and our supplemental motor movement. But the prefrontal cortex is in the very front here. And this area is going to be the last to fully develop in terms of synapses, but primarily myelin development. So this is going to get bigger and bigger and develop more specifically over time. Prefrontal cortex is involved in higher cognitive abilities and executive function. So, working memory, which is kind of maintaining your concentration on what it is that you were thinking a couple seconds ago, right? Um, Controlled attention, focusing on the important information and ignoring the information that's not important, planning for the future, executing a plan and sticking with it, um, inhibiting inappropriate behaviors, so controlling your impulses, following social rules. These all seem to involve the prefrontal cortex. And if you think about children developing into adults, you'll see that these are all skills that we're hoping that you will develop over time, right? We don't all quite get there, right? And we're not always perfect at it, but you can see why it would be much easier for an adult to control their attention, to make plans, to inhibit their impulses, and to follow social rules. And you can test the development of the prefrontal cortex. You can measure it with an MRI, but you can also do it neuropsychologically. So if somebody has damage or issues with development, they might perseverate on something like the Wisconsin card sorting task, which is actually here. You can play this online if you'd like to. There should be a link in supplemental materials. But essentially, here you've got a card and you're trying to sort it, match it with categories. And what they do in the task is, at first, you'll get feedback that you should match this with pile number 1, right? Because it's red on red. And you learn that the rule is to match to color. So this goes with red, the yellow things go with the yellow things. And then partway through the task, they'll change the rules on you, right? And it turns out that this is no longer the correct answer. And in fact, you should sort it into this category. Because now we're not matching for color, we're matching for shape. So all the pluses go together. And they'll switch the rules and switch the rules and switch the rules. People with a fully developed frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, without damage to the prefrontal cortex, can roll with the punches, they can change the rules, they can inhibit their previous response and learn new responses. This kind of adaptive, controlled thinking that deals with the world as it is in a complex way, that's the prefrontal cortex in action. And that's what we're developing later in life. So all this development is going on, right? We're developing synapses and dendrites. We're developing myelin. We're developing our frontal lobe later in life. As we're developing, we're going to interact with the world around us. And it turns out that the neurons and synapses that don't get supported through experience typically won't survive. And it turns out that without experience at certain times, you may not develop a certain brain function. There are two concepts related to this. One is called the critical period, where you have to have an experience at a certain time, otherwise those connections won't form. A sensitive period is the same idea, but a little less extreme. So if you have an experience, it will have a strongest effect during a certain time of development. But if you have the experience later in life, it will still have an effect, just not as strong. So imprinting is an example of this, where these ducks, if they have the experience of seeing a caregiver, a mother figure, they will imprint on the mother and follow that mother around throughout development. But they have to have that experience at a certain time, otherwise they won't imprint as strongly. So there's a sensitive period, kind of bordering on a critical period here for the ducks, which if they have an experience at a certain time, they'll imprint. If they don't have that experience, they'll be much less likely to imprint. And they'll imprint on a duck or a human even, depending on who's around during their imprinting period. Language development, second language development, music development, those kinds of things also have sensitive periods where if you don't develop language, you don't experience language or learn language during a certain critical or certain sensitive period, it's going to be a lot harder for you to learn language at all. There have been cases like Jeannie, who wasn't exposed to language and she had difficulty learning language at all. Or you might not be, you'll have difficulty learning a second language. You might know that if you're exposed to a second language earlier in life, it's a lot easier to pick up on the rules and complexities of the second language. Whereas if you learn language later in life, it's more difficult. Um, that's because those synapses and connections are being developed during early development. And if you have the experience in that period, you develop those connections more strongly, more easily. If you make the connections later in life, you're dealing with an already kind of formed and developed language center. Along the same lines, there's a lot of research on not specific experience like being exposed to language, but on overall experience. Okay, and there's a lot of research on the deprivation and enrichment of your environment and your exposure to the world. There's a lot of research with animals on sensory and motor deprivation or sensory motor enrichment. But deprivation studies will essentially, maybe they'll block the eyes of an animal or only expose the animal to certain wavelengths of light or only expose the animal to vertical lines and never expose them to horizontal lines, right? And we see how the brain develops and how the um, perceptual system develops when you've never seen the color red before, okay? Or when you've never seen anything, right? When you've deprived an eye of vision by covering it for early development. And what you see is that when you deprive the brain of stimulation, you get fewer synapses, fewer dendritic spines, and then you get deficits in perception, right? So the deprived eye, the axon from the thalamus, will connect with fewer synapses, right? Fewer dendrites on the other side, right? And then this issue in development will lead to issues in perception. Okay, so without exposure early on, the connections to the occipital lobe simply don't form or are pulled back because they're not getting the stimulation that they should have. So deprivation can cause deficits to brain development. In contrast, enriched environments can do the opposite. So an enriched cage, like this one, as compared to a standard cage, leads to thicker brain cortex, more synapse formation, more dendritic spines. So to a certain extent, experience is necessary for specific brain development, like language development, or imprinting in terms of psychological traits might happen during a certain period of brain development. But then more broadly, um, having an enriched experience around you is going to help you build the connections, synapses, and dendrites across your brain. Um, and having deprivation of experience is going to pull away from that. You'll have fewer synapses, fewer dendritic spines, and thinner cerebral cortex. So without proper experience, we don't get proper brain development. Last point on experience and brain development is to talk about mapping of our brain, right? So you might remember that the visual world is mapped out to our visual cortex, right? So this part of the world ends up in my left hemisphere at a certain place, right? That's all mapped out, and we like zoom in on our fovea. All of our other senses are mapped in a certain way as well, or most of them anyway. The auditory cortex is mapped to different sounds and space. The sensory and motor systems are mapped to different parts of the body. So, like our lips are mapped to a certain part of our sensory cortex. Our thumb goes here, our middle finger goes here, right? The world is mapped. But you may be thinking in this chapter, right? How did those maps form? Well, experience is going to help those maps develop, and different experiences are going to have those maps develop differently. So different experiences can shift those maps. So, for example, and your book is going to break these down, so check out your book for more details. But in some work by Rowe et al., they rewired essentially the optic nerve and the auditory nerves, and the nerves coming from the eyes were then rewired to go to the temporal lobes instead of the occipital lobes. And what happened was that the animals with the rewiring actually formed retinotopic maps on their auditory cortex. So instead of being mapped to sounds, they were mapped to space, just like your retina. In research with owls, they put special glasses on owls so that the visual signal of the world was shifted about 20 degrees, so that when they looked up here, the glasses were shifting the world about 20 degrees this way. So they would have to look about 20 degrees in the wrong direction. And when they had owls wear these glasses during development, what they found was that the occipital lobe map shifted 20 degrees. Okay? So through experience, because they were always experiencing the world shifted, their brain developed shifted in the same way. If they put the glasses on later in life, that shift didn't occur. The owl just couldn't see the world very well because they were wearing these funky glasses. But early development caused shifts to those maps. A couple other things with experience. If you get a lot of early musical training, your auditory cortex maps differently so that you get bigger areas for and more differentiated areas for complex tones. So your brain actually develops differently if you're exposed to musical training early. So you literally have a different map of sound in your auditory cortex. And similarly, if you get a lot of experience with focal hand movements, um, like playing the violin a lot, um, or sewing as a child, just sewing and sewing and sewing, you can get uh, brain development that actually causes problems like focal hand dystonia, where you have trouble moving just one finger, you move two fingers, and that's because your motor map has gotten overlapped from one to the other. So you don't necessarily have to know if you're in my class every one of these examples, but you should be aware of these examples as pointing out that experience can not just help the brain develop, but it can change the organization of the brain in terms of where my visual maps are, how my auditory maps are organized, and sort of the size and representation of different parts of my body. Okay, so experience is going to interact with brain development as we've been talking about throughout the semester.